Beneath the silk and spice lies a trail of forgotten bones. The true story of the Silk Road is not one of romance, but of ruthless exploitation. You are about to discover 30 dark truths that will permanently shatter the glossy myth of this ancient trade route. We will journey beyond the tales of Marco Polo to expose a hidden world of human suffering and systemic danger. By the end, you will possess a completely new understanding of how this network truly operated. How did a simple trade path become a superhighway for devastating plagues? And who were the millions of enslaved people whose labor built empires they would never see? What does it truly cost to connect a world? The romantic image of a single paved highway crossing continents is a complete illusion. In reality, the Silk Road was a sprawling, tangled web of countless trails, a chaotic network that stretched for over 4,000 miles. There was no map, no single route from Rome to Chang'an. Instead, travelers navigated a labyrinth of overland paths and maritime sea lanes, each with its own unique dangers. This was the first and most fundamental dark truth. No single empire or king could ever control this vast system. There was no police force, no organized military patrol to keep you safe. You were utterly on your own. A merchant setting out from Persia would have to negotiate with a dozen different local chieftains, each demanding a toll for safe passage, a promise that was often broken. The shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert could erase a trail in hours, leaving a caravan to wander until its water ran out. In the towering Pamir Mountains, a single misstep could send a man and his animals plummeting into a ravine. Bandits lurked in every narrow gorge, knowing that a passing caravan was a moving treasure chest with no one to protect it. The journey was less a commercial expedition and more a daily gamble with death. But this very chaos, this lack of any central control, had a far more terrifying consequence. It turned the entire network into a superhighway for invisible threats. A new idea in a monastery in Kashmir could find its way to a marketplace in Baghdad within a year. A religious text could travel from Damascus to the Chinese court. This uncontrolled flow of culture had a dark twin. A deadly virus born in a remote rodent population could hitch a ride on a single merchant, moving from caravan to caravan, ship to ship, until it reached a crowded city with no immunity. The very interconnectedness that defined the Silk Road was also its greatest vulnerability, a design flaw that would one day unleash devastation on a global scale. The silks that adorned Roman nobles and the spices that flavored imperial banquets carried a hidden cost paid in human flesh. While merchants grew wealthy, a massive, invisible workforce bore the weight of this trade. Human trafficking was a rampant and brutal enterprise along the Silk Road. People were not just trading goods, they were trading people. Captives from endless frontier wars, victims of village raids, and those sold into debt slavery by impossible circumstances were all funneled into this system. They were the engines of the caravans, forced to carry burdens heavier than any animal across the world's most punishing landscapes. Imagine a man, once a farmer, now shackled and stumbling through the searing heat of the Taklamakan Desert, a 70-pound bundle of silk strapped to his back. His value was less than the cargo he carried. If he collapsed from thirst or exhaustion, there was no mercy. The caravan could not stop. His body would be left where it fell, a silent monument to the trade's true foundation, quickly buried by the relentless shifting sands. This was not an occasional tragedy, it was a routine calculation of profit and loss. The entire economic structure, the glittering flow of luxuries between empires, was fundamentally built upon this bedrock of suffering. The road's grandeur was literally carried on the backs of the enslaved, their misery the dark, unacknowledged price of a connected world. And just as the road carried people and products, it also transmitted the very ideas that justified this cruelty. That same network of caravan trails and merchant ships which carried silk and spices also became the world's first superhighway for deadly pathogens. The very connections that moved luxury goods with astonishing speed were now transporting something far more sinister. A single merchant feeling unwell in a bustling Asian port could board a ship completely unaware that he was carrying a stowaway. Hidden in the bales of cloth and sacks of grain were fleas, and on those fleas a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, the cause of the bubonic plague. The journey was a perfect incubator. Crowded caravanserais where travelers and their animals rested in close quarters became hotspots for transmission. A flea would jump from a dying rat to a living one or directly to a human, and then the entire caravan would move on, carrying the invisible killer to the next town. This is how the first great pandemic traveled. In the 6th century, the plague of Justinian spread from the Silk Road's eastern terminals into the Byzantine Empire, killing tens of millions and crippling an emperor's reign. But this was only a rehearsal. Centuries later, the system delivered its most devastating blow, the Black Death. Riding the same routes that once carried only wealth, the plague reached Europe in the 1300s. It did not discriminate between prince and pauper. Within a few years, it wiped out an estimated half of Europe's entire population. The interconnectedness that was the Silk Road's greatest achievement became the engine of a biological catastrophe. The price for a handful of spice, it turned, could be the death of a continent. This constant threat of invisible disease was matched only by the very visible danger of human predators. The wealth flowing along the Silk Road did not go unnoticed. It created a target, painting a giant bullseye on every caravan and ship. Organized banditry was not a random occurrence, it was a calculated industry. Gangs would lie in wait in the perfect terrain for an ambush, like the narrow gorges of the Pamir Mountains or the shifting dunes of the Taklamakan Desert. There, a caravan was at its most vulnerable, stretched out in a long, slow-moving line. The attack would be swift and brutal. A hail of arrows from the cliffs above would be followed by a furious charge. The goal was total annihilation, to leave no witnesses who could identify the raiders to any distant authority. A merchant could spend a lifetime building his fortune, only to lose it all in a single, violent hour, his body left to be scavenged by desert wolves. The danger did not end at the shoreline. Maritime trade routes were haunted by pirates who viewed merchant ships as floating treasure chests. Using fast, agile vessels, they would swarm a lumbering trade ship, overwhelming its crew. Survivors faced a grim choice, a quick death or a slow one in chains, sold into the very slave markets their cargo was meant to supply. This omnipresent risk fundamentally reshaped the economics of the entire trade. To have any hope of safe passage, a merchant had to invest heavily in protection. He would hire bands of armed guards, mercenaries whose loyalty was only as strong as the payment. This security tax was enormous, and that cost was not absorbed by the merchant. It was passed down the line, added to the price of every bolt of silk and every ounce of pepper. The luxury goods that defined the Silk Road were so expensive precisely because their price had to cover the high probability of theft and murder. The romantic idea of a solitary merchant on a peaceful journey is a complete fiction. Survival was a group effort demanding constant paranoia and the financial means to buy a sliver of safety. This cultural dominance went far deeper than commerce. The very languages you spoke and the gods you worshipped were at stake along the trade routes. While history praises the Silk Road for spreading Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, this exchange was rarely a gentle process of persuasion. It was often a tool of empire, a form of soft power with a hard edge. A local chieftain seeking favor with a powerful Persian merchant prince might convert to his religion, and soon his entire village would be expected to follow. The old local shrine, once the heart of the community, would be abandoned or torn down, its stories and rituals forgotten within a generation. The Sogdian people, once master traders of Central Asia, saw their vibrant language and Zoroastrian traditions slowly suffocated by the rising tide of Arab Islamic culture following the conquest. Their unique identity, built over centuries, did not simply blend, it was systematically overwritten. Even the great Chinese Empire, while famously absorbing foreign ideas like Buddhism, consistently projected its own cultural superiority. It demanded tribute and deference, effectively forcing surrounding kingdoms to adopt Chinese script, administrative practices, and court protocols to be considered civilized. This was not a two-way street of mutual respect. It was a hierarchy where the culture of the powerful flowed downhill, Chinese letter, and burying the traditions of the less powerful. The result was a silent, slow-moving catastrophe, the death of 1,000 small cuts. Countless local dialects, art forms, and spiritual beliefs vanished not in a dramatic conquest, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of economic necessity and imperial prestige. What we celebrate as a mosaic of cultural exchange was for many the story of their own erasure. The relentless march of caravans did not just reshape cultures, it scarred the earth itself. The very ground beneath the traders' feet paid a heavy price for this global connection. To sustain the endless flow of traffic, entire forests were felled. The wood was needed to construct the sprawling caravanserais that dotted the route and to fuel the countless cooking fires for travelers and their guards. In regions that were already arid, this deforestation had a catastrophic domino effect. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, the land began to erode. Fertile topsoil, built up over millennia, was simply washed or blown away, leaving behind barren, rocky ground that could no longer support agriculture. This process, known as desertification, turned once viable landscapes into permanent deserts, a bleak inheritance for future generations. The most critical casualties, however, were the oases. These pockets of life in the desert were not just rest stops, they were the entire reason certain routes were even possible. A single oasis could support a small town with a delicate underground aquifer feeding its date palms and gardens. But when a caravan of 200 men and 300 camels arrived, the demand for water was immense. They would drink their fill, water all their animals, and replenish their heavy waterskins for the journey ahead. Over decades, this constant overuse drained the aquifers faster than they could be replenished by rare desert rains. An oasis would slowly shrink, its ponds turning to mud, then to cracked, dry earth. The date palms would wither and die. When an oasis failed, it did not just disappear from a map. It became a death sentence for the next caravan that relied on it, stranding them in a waterless void. The local ecosystem, which had evolved for centuries around that water source, would collapse completely. Beyond the immediate landscape, the Silk Road's appetite for luxury created a different kind of extinction. The demand for exotic goods like ivory for intricate carvings or the furs of snow leopards for imperial robes placed an unbearable hunting pressure on regional wildlife. These animals were not hunted for sustenance but for status. As their value in distant markets soared, local hunters were incentivized to track them to the very last individual. Some species were pushed to the brink of vanishing forever from their native ranges, their populations severed by a trade route that valued their parts more than their existence. The environmental cost of the Silk Road was a slow, silent debt that accumulated with every passing caravan, a debt that we are still understanding today. The wealth of the Silk Road did not build peaceful empires, it forged war machines. Control over a single key city like Samarkand or Kashgar meant the power to tax every caravan for 1,000 miles, funding vast armies and lavish palaces. This potential for limitless riches turned these urban centers into prizes to be seized, not partners to be traded with. For centuries, empires from the Han Chinese to the Mongols and beyond waged relentless campaigns, not for ideology or glory alone, but for the cold, hard currency of the trade routes. A merchant might arrive at the gates of a bustling city one year, only to return a decade later to find it a smoldering ruin, its population massacred or dragged away in chains. The civilian toll in these conflicts was catastrophic. When a city was besieged, its people were the first to suffer from starvation and disease. If the walls were breached, the aftermath was often a systematic slaughter. Those not killed outright faced a grim new life as spoils of war, added to the slave markets that the Silk Road itself sustained. The very prosperity that made these cities shine also made them targets, doomed to cycles of destruction and rebirth. The road to silk was not merely paved with blood, it was irrigated by it. Every bolt of silk that reached a Roman noble, every string of pearls that adorned a Persian queen, carried with it the invisible weight of these forgotten battles, fought by countless souls whose only crime was living on a path of immense wealth. This cycle of violence created a paradox where the very system that generated incredible prosperity also guaranteed its own perpetual instability. For every merchant who returned with chests of gold, a dozen more vanished without a trace. The reality of their life was a brutal marathon of endurance, a test of body and spirit that few could survive unscathed. Forget the image of a portly businessman haggling in a sunlit market. The typical trader was a gaunt figure, hardened by years of exposure, his face etched with the memory of countless near disasters. His journey was not measured in miles, but in seasons. A single round trip from the Mediterranean to China could consume 5 years of a man's life. During that time, he was a ghost to his family. He would miss the birth of his children, the death of his parents, and every harvest in between. His only connection to home was the fragile hope that he would one day return, a hope that dwindled with every passing month in a foreign land. The physical toll was relentless. Malnutrition was a constant companion as caravans carried only non-perishable bland food. Scurvy from a lack of fresh fruit would loosen a man's teeth and drain his strength. Dysentery from contaminated water sources could strike without warning, dehydrating a traveler to the point of delirium in the span of a single day. Many merchants did not die in dramatic bandit raids, but slowly and ignobly, curled up in the corner of a caravanserai, their bodies racked by a fever no one could name. The psychological isolation was its own unique torment. Surrounded by strangers speaking a cacophony of unfamiliar languages, a merchant lived inside his own head for years on end. He was perpetually alert, trusting no one completely, knowing that a friendly smile could hide a plot to rob him. The silence of the desert or the mountains was not peaceful, it was oppressive, amplifying every worry about his business and his family. If he finally made it home, he was often a different person, aged beyond his years and haunted by the things he had seen. The road did not just carry goods, it consumed the merchants themselves, grinding down their health and spirit for a chance at a fortune that for most remained a cruel and distant mirage. The same camels that carried silk and spices also bore a more insidious cargo, one that could enslave the mind instead of the body. Opium, cannabis, and other potent psychoactives moved along the trade routes as readily as any luxury good. Cultivated in the highlands of Central Asia, these substances were packed into discrete bundles, their true value lying not in their weight, but in their power to alter human consciousness. In the bustling markets of Persia or the crowded ports of the Indian Ocean, a merchant could trade a small pouch of opium resin for a fortune in silver. While some cultures used these plants in long-standing religious rituals or as traditional medicines, the demand in other societies was purely for escapism and recreation. This created a hidden economy of addiction, a dark mirror to the trade in silks and jewels. A wealthy noble in a distant capital might develop a costly habit, his gold steadily flowing eastward to feed a dependency he could not control. But the true cost was often borne by the common people in towns along the route, where local use could spiral into widespread social decay. Families were fractured by addiction, and individuals became trapped in a cycle where their need for the next dose overrode everything else. This trade required no whips or chains, yet it created a form of bondage just as effective, exploiting human vulnerability for profit. The narcotics flowing silently along the Silk Road proved that the most damaging cargo is not always the one that is heaviest, but the one that rewrites a person's very will. Trust was a luxury no merchant could truly afford, for the person sharing your campfire might be reporting your every word to a distant throne. The Silk Road was a perfect breeding ground for spies. Empires quickly realized that the endless stream of caravans offered the ultimate cover for intelligence gathering. A seemingly ordinary merchant haggling over the price of cinnamon could be meticulously counting the soldiers at a city's gate. A humble monk on a pilgrimage might be sketching the layout of a mountain pass, a map that would later guide an invading army. These agents were not just passive observers, they were active saboteurs. A well-placed piece of misinformation could start a trade war between two rival cities, crippling their economies for the benefit of the empire that planted the lie. A single poisoned skin of wine delivered to the right official could remove a key political obstacle without a single sword being drawn in the open. The stakes were unimaginably high. A spy who discovered that a neighboring kingdom's army was weakened by disease could provide the intelligence needed for a decisive, devastating invasion. This clandestine trade in secrets created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia. A merchant had to be careful about every conversation, never knowing if a casual complaint about high taxes would be twisted into a report of sedition. Alliances between trading partners were fragile, constantly tested by the suspicion that one side was leaking information to a third party. The exchange of goods was perfectly mirrored by a hidden exchange of information, where a detailed report on a rival's grain supplies was a treasure more valuable than any gemstone. In this shadow war, a carefully whispered secret could topple a dynasty, proving that the most dangerous cargo carried along the Silk Road was not a disease or a weapon, but a single piece of the right knowledge delivered into the wrong hands. A new faith could arrive not with a gentle sermon, but with the glint of a conqueror's sword. The spread of Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity along the Silk Road was frequently a story of power, not piety. When a new empire expanded its territory, its state religion often came as part of the package, a mandatory element of submission. A local chieftain, after his army was defeated, would be given a stark choice: convert and swear allegiance to the new god and king, or face the complete destruction of his community and the enslavement of his people. The magnificent Buddhist statues of Bamiyan, for example, did not stand for centuries because of universal tolerance. They represented the religious dominance of the Kushan Empire, a dominance that would itself be challenged and erased by later waves of Islamic conquest. The destruction was not merely symbolic. Older temples, sacred groves, and Zoroastrian fire altars were systematically torn down, their stones repurposed to build mosques or monasteries. This physical erasure sent an unmistakable message: the old gods are dead, and the new order demands your devotion. For the common person, the pressure was economic and social. Those who refused to convert could be subjected to a special tax, the jizya, a heavy financial burden designed to make clinging to an old faith untenable. They would find themselves excluded from the most lucrative trade guilds, their businesses shunned by the new religious majority. A family might hold onto its ancestral beliefs in secret for a generation, whispering prayers behind closed doors, but their children, facing a world of limited opportunity, would often feel compelled to adopt the dominant religion simply to survive. The spiritual map of Asia was not woven through peaceful debate. It was carved with the tools of coercion, leaving deep scars of resentment that, in some regions, have never fully healed. The gleaming silk that draped a Roman senator began its life in a humble village, spun by hands that would never feel its softness. The global hunger for luxury created a brutal economic trap for the very people who made these treasures. An artisan in a Chinese silk workshop or a farmer harvesting peppercorns in southern India was paid a pittance, a tiny fraction of the final price their goods would command in a market thousands of miles away. They were the foundation of the entire system, yet they saw almost none of its glittering rewards. A complex chain of middlemen stood between the producer and the consumer. A local buyer would purchase the raw silk at a rock-bottom price. He would then sell it to a regional merchant who transported it to a major city like Samarkand. There, another merchant would buy it, adding his own profit margin before the silk began its long, dangerous overland journey. By the time it reached its final destination, its price had been inflated by a dozen different hands, each taking a cut, while the original artisan remained in his village no richer than before. This system did more than just create poverty, it forged chains of dependency. A farming community that once grew a diverse range of crops to feed itself might be encouraged or even forced by local rulers to dedicate all its land to a single cash crop like pepper or cotton. This was a dangerous gamble. If the distant demand for pepper suddenly collapsed or if a new trade route opened up offering a cheaper source, the entire community would face immediate famine. They had no food to fall back on, having sacrificed their own food security for the illusion of profit that never truly materialized. The regions that produced the world's most desired luxuries were often the ones locked in perpetual poverty, their labor enriching empires and merchants who viewed them as nothing more than a cheap source of goods. The wealth of the Silk Road flowed in one direction only, outward, leaving behind exhausted land and generations of exploited workers. The invisible plague that traveled the trade routes was not just an accidental passenger, it became a deliberate weapon. Long before the science of germs was understood, the Silk Road provided the means for a terrifying innovation in conflict biological warfare. The most infamous example occurred in the year 1347, during the Mongol siege of the Genos port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. The Mongol army, which had been traveling the same routes as merchants, was itself stricken by the Black Death. As their soldiers died in droves, a grim new tactic was born. They began using catapults to hurl the plague-ridden corpses of their own men over the city's fortified walls. This was more than an act of psychological terror. It was a calculated attempt to poison the well, literally and figuratively. The defenders inside Kaffa watched in horror as these gruesome projectiles landed in their streets. Soon, the telltale signs of the plague appeared, boils and fevers spreading like wildfire through the cramped, besieged population. When the Genos traders finally managed to break the siege and flee by sea, they carried more than just their survival. They carried the plague with them, first to Sicily and then throughout the Mediterranean, directly triggering the European pandemic that would kill tens of millions. This single act of war demonstrates a chilling awareness of contagion, a brutal understanding that a sick body could be as effective as a siege engine. The very interconnectedness that made the Silk Road a marvel of human enterprise was now being weaponized, turning a pandemic into a tool of conquest and showing that the road's darkest truths could always find a new, more horrifying expression. The very name Silk Road is a beautiful lie. It conjures an image of soft, shimmering fabrics flowing effortlessly between civilizations, a term that obscures the route's true, gritty nature. In reality, silk was a luxury item, a high-value symbol for the elite, but it was never the economic backbone of this vast network. The real workhorses of the trade were the heavy, utilitarian, and often brutal goods that fueled empires and everyday life. Think of the endless caravans not as processions of elegance, but as convoys of raw power. Tough Central Asian horses, essential for cavalry, were driven in massive herds toward Chinese armies. Heavy ingots of iron and tin, the materials of swords and plowshares, clanked in wooden crates. Sturdy glassware from Roman Syria, practical pottery, and the revolutionary material of paper, which would transform record-keeping across continents. These were the items traded in far greater volume than any delicate textile. This was not a road of whispers and softness. It was a highway of clattering metal and the groaning of overburdened carts. By focusing on the romance of silk, we ignore the sheer physical labor and human suffering required to move these dense, essential commodities. The men who hauled these loads, the slaves who mined the metals, and the animals that died under the weight, their stories are buried beneath the appealing myth of a silk-draped route. The name itself is a distraction, a marketing term from a bygone era that prevents us from seeing the true, unglamorous engine of commerce that truly shaped the ancient world. And if the name is a lie, then what other beautiful deceptions have we accepted about the people who walked this path? Caravanserais promised shelter, but they delivered a different kind of education in survival. These walled compounds appeared as fortresses of safety in the vast emptiness of the desert, but stepping through their gates meant entering a world of constant, low-grade dread. Forget any romantic image of travelers peacefully sharing stories around a fire. The reality was a crowded, filthy, and deafeningly loud pen for humans and animals alike. Hundreds of camels, donkeys, and horses were packed into the central courtyard, their waste mixing with mud underfoot, creating a thick, putrid stench that clung to your clothes and skin. You slept not in a private room, but in a cramped, open cell lining the walls, separated from your neighbors by nothing more than a thin curtain, if you were lucky. The air was thick with the sounds of coughing, snoring animals, and arguments in a dozen different languages. This was not a place of rest, it was a holding tank where exhaustion battled with hypervigilance. In these conditions, disease was a silent, guaranteed guest. A merchant with a mild fever from one caravan could, in a single night, pass a deadly illness to a dozen others, who would then carry it in 5 different directions at sunrise. The caravanserai did not just host travelers, it incubated plagues, ensuring a constant, simmering reservoir of sickness that pulsed along the entire trade route. But the biological threat was only half the danger. These way stations were the perfect hunting grounds for criminals. A skilled thief could easily identify the wealthiest merchant simply by observing who had the most guards or the heaviest packs. He would note where the man slept, listening for the telltale clink of a coin purse. An assassination could be arranged in the chaotic throng, a quick blade in the crowded courtyard, with the killer vanishing into the departing crowd at first light. And of course, spies operated with impunity. A government agent could pose as a fellow merchant, sharing a meal and subtly probing for information about trade volumes, political unrest, or military movements, all under the guise of friendly conversation. Every conversation was a potential trap, every friendly face a possible threat. To close your eyes in a caravanserai was an act of profound faith, a gamble that the person in the next cell was not plotting your demise. The walls kept the desert out, but they trapped a far more human form of danger within. That shimmering thread, so prized by emperors, was spun in a prison of silence. The Chinese monopoly on silk was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate policy enforced by terror. For over 1,000 years, the empire guarded the secret of sericulture, the art of raising silkworms and weaving their cocoons into cloth, as if it were a matter of national security. The penalty for revealing this process to any foreigner was a single, grim outcome: execution. Imagine the immense pressure on the countless workers, mostly women, who spent their lives inside state-controlled silk workshops. They knew every intricate step, from the careful feeding of the mulberry leaves to the delicate process of unwinding the single, continuous filament from the cocoon in hot water. This knowledge was a death sentence waiting to be spoken aloud. A careless word to a trader from the West, a whispered explanation to a curious visitor, and the result would not be a fine but a public beheading. The entire industry was built on a foundation of fear, where innovation was stifled and the only permitted technique was the state-approved method. This brutal suppression of knowledge guaranteed China's economic dominance for centuries, creating a trade deficit so vast that it drained the Roman Empire of its gold and silver. The West's desperate desire for this fabric funded China's military and cultural golden ages. all because the empire understood that the true power lay not in the silk itself, but in the deadly secrecy of how to make it. This was not merely commerce, it was intellectual tyranny, proving that the most valuable currency on the Silk Road was not a metal, but a forbidden piece of information. The road did not just use slaves, it actively manufactured them on an industrial scale. While some were forced to carry cargo, the Silk Road's infrastructure itself evolved into a sprawling, continent-wide marketplace for human lives. After every successful military campaign, the victors would round up thousands of captives from the conquered lands. These were not just soldiers, but farmers, artisans, and entire families from Central Asian steppes, Slavic villages, and Caucasian mountains. They were marched in long, chained lines to the major trading hubs like Bukhara and Samarkand, where their fate would be decided at a slave auction. The demand was insatiable. A Persian noble needed household servants to display his status. An Arab caliph required slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, to fill his army with men who had no local loyalties. Chinese emperors sought exotic concubines from distant lands to adorn their inner courts. Each of these roles represented a different kind of erasure. A young man from the grasslands, trained as a Mamluk, would have his past systematically stripped away. His name, his language, his family, all were replaced by a new identity as a professional warrior, utterly dependent on his master. A woman taken as a concubine might live in unparalleled luxury, but she was a prisoner in a gilded cage, severed from her homeland forever, her children raised as heirs to a culture that was not her own. This was not a side effect of trade, it was a core industry. The revenue from selling human beings funded further conquests, which in turn produced more slaves, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence and exploitation. The Silk Road became the central artery for a forced diaspora that scattered millions across Eurasia, their individual stories of loss and resilience swallowed by the sheer, brutal efficiency of the market. How many languages, how many family lineages simply vanished into the dust of that road, their echoes lost to the clamor of the auction block. The caravanserai's gates closed behind you, but they could never lock out the dread. This relentless psychological strain was a tax on the soul, a slow erosion of the mind that few travelers could escape. The fear was not a fleeting emotion, it was a constant companion. Every distant silhouette on the horizon could be a bandit scout. Every unusual sound in the night, the creak of a leather strap or the snort of a camel, might signal the beginning of an attack. This state of hypervigilance, of never feeling truly safe, frayed the nerves over months and years. Sleep was not restful, but a vulnerable state to be endured, leaving many travelers in a permanent fog of exhaustion. Then there was the landscape itself, a master of psychological torture. The Taklamakan Desert was not just hot, it was a sea of silence. The emptiness was absolute, broken only by the wind hissing over dunes that stretched to the horizon in every direction. In that profound quiet, a person's own thoughts became deafening. Guilt over leaving a family behind, anxiety about a business venture failing, the sheer weight of your own insignificance under that vast, indifferent sky. It could crush a person's spirit long before their body gave out. Many accounts from the time describe merchants falling into a deep melancholy, refusing to eat or speak, simply staring into the distance as if they had already left their bodies behind in the sand. We would recognize this now as severe depression and post-traumatic stress, a mind broken not by a single event, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of the journey itself. The most profound injury was the loneliness. A merchant might travel for 5 years, surrounded by hired guards and fellow traders, yet be utterly isolated. These were not friendships forged in trust, but temporary alliances of convenience. He could not share his deepest fears or his longing for home, for that would be seen as weakness, an invitation for exploitation. He lived inside a shell of his own making, a prisoner of his thoughts, with no comfort or counsel for years on end. When he finally returned home, he was often a stranger in his own house, his eyes holding a distance that his family could not bridge. The road did not just claim lives, it shattered minds, leaving behind invisible wounds that never truly healed. The wealth that built empires also carried the seeds of their destruction. Rome's insatiable appetite for silk and spices created a bizarre economic paradox. As shiploads of these luxuries arrived in Roman ports, endless caravans of gold and silver traveled in the opposite direction, a one-way river of precious metal flowing east to pay for it all. This massive trade deficit bled the Roman treasury dry, causing severe inflation at home. The value of Roman currency plummeted as coins became less precious, making it increasingly difficult for the state to pay its legions and maintain its vast infrastructure. The very symbols of Roman power were being melted down and shipped away to purchase the very symbols of its decadence, but the financial hemorrhage was only part of the problem. The Silk Road acted as a grand university for warfare. Advanced military technologies, once held as state secrets, now traveled as freely as any merchant's wares. Chinese expertise in crossbows and sophisticated siege engines could be studied and reverse-engineered by Rome's enemies. Metallurgical secrets for forging stronger steel blades moved from Persian forges to the workshops of nomadic tribes on the empire's borders. The road did not just transport goods, it disseminated the means of violence, leveling the playing field between the civilized empire and the so-called barbarians. Most critically, the route itself facilitated the movement of entire populations. Pressed by climate change or attracted by the wealth they saw flowing along the trade routes, powerful nomadic confederations like the Huns began their great migrations. They used the Silk Road as their highway, moving with terrifying speed and encountering weakened border defenses armed with better weapons and tactics learned from the empires they preyed upon. The Huns did not emerge from a vacuum. They were funneled and empowered by the very network Rome depended on for its luxuries. The empire, financially weakened and strategically outmaneuvered, found itself besieged by enemies it had, in a very real sense, created and equipped. The Silk Road was not merely a path of commerce, it was a circuit that connected an empire's vibrant heart to the instruments of its own eventual collapse. Their suffering was a silent, relentless engine of commerce. While we count the human toll, we must also remember the animals, the camels, horses, donkeys, and oxen whose forced labor made the entire Silk Road possible. Their lives were spent in a cycle of pure agony. A Bactrian camel, the ship of the desert, could carry loads of 400 pounds or more, a crushing weight strapped to its back for weeks on end. In the blistering heat of the Taklamakan, its thick coat became a furnace, and water was a rationed luxury, doled out in sips when its body screamed for gallons. The same creature would then be driven into the frozen, thin air of the Pamir Mountains, where the stone trails were slick with ice and a single misstep meant a broken leg and a swift, brutal death. There was no retirement for these animals, only a final, total collapse. When a camel succumbed to exhaustion, its load was simply divided among the others in the caravan, and its carcass was left where it fell. The trails were marked by these bleached skeletons, macabre signposts that guided the next caravan toward its destination. For the merchants, this was a simple calculation of loss, a line item in a ledger. The death of a few animals was an acceptable expense against the profit of a successful journey. But for the creature itself, it was an eternity of pain, driven forward by the crack of a whip and the desperate shouts of men who saw it not as a living being, but as a piece of equipment, disposable and replaceable. This was the true, grinding reality of the trade, a system built not just on human suffering, but on the broken backs of countless innocent creatures whose only crime was their own strength. That caravan owner's ledger told a brutal story of its own. On one side, a fortune in profits from silks sold in Antioch, a sum so vast it could purchase an entire village. On the other, a tiny list of expenses, the pittance paid to the dozens of porters, guards, and camel drivers who made the journey possible. This was the economic reality of the Silk Road, a system that did not flatten the world, but carved it into deep, unforgiving chasms between the few who owned the trade and the many who powered it. A handful of merchant princes and ruling families sat at the network's key choke points, controlling the flow of goods and amassing wealth beyond imagination. They lived in palatial homes in Samarkand or Changan, their walls adorned with treasures from across the known world, their tables overflowing with delicacies their own porters could never afford to taste. Meanwhile, the guards who defended the caravan from bandits risked their lives for a wage that barely covered their food. The farmers who grew the cotton or the peppercorns saw their crops bought for a fraction of their value, locked in a cycle of debt to the same merchants who would sell them for 100-fold profit 1,000 miles away. This was not a world of upward mobility, it was a rigid caste system enforced by capital. A porter's son would remain a porter, his muscles sold to carry the luxuries that would forever adorn someone else's life. This concentration of wealth did more than just create poverty, it bred a deep, simmering resentment. When a caravan owner returned to his city, flaunting his new riches while the families of guards killed on the route received nothing, the social fabric strained to its breaking point. Occasional riots and revolts in trading cities were not random acts of chaos. They were the inevitable outbursts from a population that saw the rewards of their own labor perpetually flowing into the same few hands. The Silk Road proved that global connection does not automatically bring shared prosperity. It can just as easily build a taller pedestal for the elite, leaving the masses to bear the weight below. The stories of sea serpents and mountains that touched the moon were not just fables, they were carefully crafted weapons. In the cutthroat world of Silk Road commerce, truth was a commodity to be controlled, and misinformation was a strategic investment. To protect their lucrative monopolies, powerful merchant guilds and empires actively spread terrifying lies about the world beyond their controlled routes. A Persian merchant, for instance, had a vested interest in ensuring all trade between China and the West passed through his city, where he could levy heavy taxes. How could he guarantee this? By ensuring no one dared to take a shorter, cheaper path through the northern steppes. So he would fund travelers to return with horrifying accounts of that route. They would speak of tribes of one-eyed giants who feasted on human flesh, or of valleys filled with poisonous vapors that could kill a man in minutes. These were not just campfire stories, they were a calculated disinformation campaign designed to create a mental prison for their competitors. The goal was to paint their own well-guarded path as the only safe option, however expensive or long it might be. Mapmakers, often in the pay of these guilds, would engrave these fictional monsters onto their charts, lending a false authority to the deception. The phrase "here be dragons" was not an admission of ignorance, it was a deliberate business strategy. An entire geography of fear was constructed not to explore the unknown, but to keep others from doing so, ensuring that the river of gold continued to flow through the correct hands. The greatest barriers on the Silk Road were not always mountains or deserts, but the walls of lies built to protect a profit margin. The same greed that once fueled the caravan trade now drives shovels into the earth under the cover of night. For decades, the ancient sites dotting the Silk Road have been systematically ravaged by looters, their work erasing entire chapters of history for a handful of coins on the black market. These are not archaeologists carefully brushing away dust. They are treasure hunters who tunnel directly into the heart of a 2,000-year-old tomb, shattering pottery, scattering human remains, and ripping jewelry from the necks of skeletons. Their only goal is to find a single intact statue or a string of ancient beads that can be sold to a private collector. In their frantic search, they destroy the one thing that gives an artifact its true meaning, its context. A coin found next to a skeleton in a royal tomb tells us about trade and burial rites. That same coin, ripped from the ground and sold in a back room, becomes just a pretty old object. The looters are burning the library of the past to warm their hands for a single night. This plunder has been especially devastating for the cultures that history already knows the least about. The Sogdians, the Tocharians, the Kushans, their stories were not written in grand imperial chronicles. Their histories were held in the everyday objects buried with them, the style of a broken comb, the remnants of a unique textile, the seeds of a meal left as an offering. When a looter smashes a burial urn to see if it contains gold, he is not just stealing an artifact. He is deleting the last remaining evidence of a people, ensuring their language, their beliefs, and their very existence will remain a permanent mystery. The legacy of this destruction is a fractured understanding, a puzzle with most of its pieces forever lost. Also, a few treasures can gather dust in a secret collection, their true stories silenced forever. Small hands were perfectly suited for tying the microscopic knots of a priceless carpet. The global demand for luxuries created a market not just for goods, but for the smallest and most vulnerable of workers. Children were a common sight in the workshops and caravans along the Silk Road, their youth making them a cheap and easily controlled labor force. Impoverished families facing starvation or overwhelming debt often had no choice but to sell a son or daughter to a traveling merchant or a local workshop owner. It was a desperate transaction, a child's future traded for a few coins that might keep the rest of the family alive for another season. Once taken, these children entered a world of relentless toil. A boy might be put to work in a spice warehouse, his small fingers carefully sorting peppercorns from debris for 12 hours a day, the pungent dust filling his lungs and stinging his eyes. A girl could be set before a massive loom, forced to tie thousands of knots each day to create intricate patterns she would never own. Their small stature was exploited for tasks adults could not perform as efficiently, but their pay was a fraction of an adult's if they were paid at all. The work was monotonous and physically crippling. Long hours hunched over looms deformed young spines. The constant exposure to spice dust or textile fibers led to chronic respiratory illnesses. There were no breaks for play, no schools to attend, and certainly no one to hear their cries. They were disposable cogs in a vast commercial machine, their childhood systematically erased to ensure a steady supply of affordable luxuries for the wealthy. For these children, the Silk Road was not a route to adventure. It was a prison with no visible walls, a life sentence of labor that began before they had even learned to dream of anything else. This ancient network was the world's first prototype for globalization, and its flaws are startlingly familiar. The Silk Road proved that connecting distant economies creates a chain of immense fragility, where a single break in one link can snap the entire system. A rebellion in a Central Asian city could cut off the supply of horses to a Chinese army, altering the balance of power in a war 1,000 miles away. A drought in the farmlands of Persia could cause a famine in the spice markets of India, as food stores were sold for export to wealthier regions instead of feeding the local population. This interdependence was not a safety net, it was a web of shared vulnerability. The relentless pursuit of profit consistently overrode any consideration for the people or the land that produced the wealth. Local rulers, enticed by the promise of foreign gold, would force their farmers to grow cash crops until the soil was exhausted and their people were hungry, repeating the same destructive pattern from one kingdom to the next. We see these same ancient problems echoing in our modern world. A financial crisis that begins on one continent now ripples across the globe in hours, not years. The demand for cheap goods still fuels exploitative labor practices in distant factories. The environmental cost of shipping products across oceans mirrors the desertification left behind by the caravans. The Silk Road was not just a route of trade, it was a 2,000-year-long warning. A test run for a connected planet that revealed how easily commerce can become a conduit for shared crisis, a lesson we are still struggling to learn today. The very technologies that defined progress were also the most fiercely guarded secrets. We often celebrate the Silk Road for spreading innovations like paper and gunpowder, but this exchange was rarely a gift. It was a high-stakes game of technological espionage where empires clung to their advantages with an iron grip. A state that possessed the formula for high-quality steel or the intricate process for making paper held a decisive military and economic edge. To release that knowledge was to empower a potential rival, a risk no ruler was willing to take. The Chinese monopoly on silk production is the most famous example, but the suppression of paper-making was just as ruthless. For centuries, the Chinese court successfully kept the secret of turning mulberry bark and hemp into durable, cheap writing material. This was not an accidental delay, it was a calculated policy of technological containment. When the knowledge did finally escape, it was not through peaceful trade, but through a moment of violent conflict. After a battle at the Talas River in the year 751, Arab forces captured several Chinese artisans who possessed the forbidden craft. These men were not treated as prisoners of war, they were treated as living treasure troves of intelligence, forced to reveal their skills to their captors. This is how paper-making first reached the Islamic world, not through a merchant's goodwill but through the spoils of war. The punishment for such technological treason back home would have been immediate execution. This pattern repeated itself for other critical advancements. The secret of sericulture, the complex chemistry for vibrant dyes, and advanced metallurgical techniques for forging stronger swords all moved along a shadow road of industrial espionage. A spy would not be seeking military plans, but the layout of a workshop or the recipe for a ceramic glaze. Those caught smuggling technological secrets faced a fate far worse than common thieves. Their public death served as a grim warning to others, a stark reminder that in the economy of knowledge, some ideas were deemed too valuable to share. The glittering exchange of goods was underpinned by a desperate, clandestine war over the power that knowledge itself could provide. The relentless demand for silk and spices fundamentally reshaped the land itself, transforming fertile fields into a single, fragile commodity. A farming village that once cultivated a rich diversity of grains and vegetables to feed its own people might be commanded by its rulers to uproot everything and plant only mulberry trees for silkworms. This was not a choice made for sustainability, but a desperate gamble on the distant, fickle desires of foreign markets. For a few years, the system seemed to work. The village sold its silk for silver, using that money to buy imported grain from another region. But this new prosperity was a dangerous illusion, a house built on sand. The community had sacrificed its food security, its very ability to feed itself for a handful of coins. Then the inevitable shock would arrive. A war between two distant empires could suddenly block the trade route, severing the supply of imported grain. A prolonged drought in the breadbasket region that supplied their food could cause prices to skyrocket, placing that grain entirely out of reach for the now specialized village. With no food growing in their own fields and no money to buy it from others, the people faced a horrifying reckoning. The very trade that had promised wealth now delivered starvation. The caravans that once carried their silk to the world would now pass by their silent, empty homes, carrying sustenance they could no longer afford. This was the ultimate dark truth of a connected economy, where a decision made in a palace to maximize profit could, years later and 1,000 miles away, lead to the slow, silent extinction of an entire community. The Silk Road did not just transport goods, it exported vulnerability, leaving a trail of ghost towns that had bet their survival on a market that had no memory of their existence. That beautiful silk tapestry we admire in a museum is woven with threads of forgotten agony. Our modern romance with the Silk Road is a carefully crafted illusion, a form of historical amnesia that airbrushes the suffering right out of the picture. We celebrate the glittering artifacts in glass cases and the thrilling tales of Marco Polo, while completely ignoring the brutal reality that produced them. The true foundation of this history is not the spice but the sweat, not the silk but the scars. Every time we use the term Silk Road with a sense of wonder, we are participating in a cover-up, erasing the millions of enslaved porters, the children in workshops, the merchants who died of loneliness in the desert, and the entire cities wiped out by plague. This glorification is not harmless, it is a dangerous distortion. It allows us to believe that global connection and vast wealth were achieved without an unbearable human cost. We look at a delicate porcelain vase and see only its beauty, not the exhausted potter who never saw a coin of its final price. We read of a great trading city and imagine bustling markets, not the siege that reduced it to rubble and its people to slaves just a decade earlier. By focusing only on the beautiful survivors of that age, we tacitly agree that the suffering required to produce them was a price worth paying. This prevents us from asking the most crucial questions about our own interconnected world today. What hidden suffering fuels our modern luxuries, whose labor is being erased from the story we tell ourselves about progress and global trade? Remembering the Silk Road only for its wonders is like remembering a battlefield only for the elegant uniforms of the generals, a silent agreement to forget the blood soaked into the ground beneath their feet. The true currency of the Silk Road was not gold or silk, but a chilling moral calculus where human life was assigned a price and found wanting. This relentless pursuit of profit provided a ready-made excuse for every horror, a justification that echoed from the slave markets to the emperor's court. A merchant could watch a porter collapse from exhaustion and simply note the loss in his ledger before ordering the man's body dragged off the trail. His conscience was clear because the ledger balanced. The system did not merely allow for such thinking, it demanded it. When a city like Samarkand rebelled against a trade monopoly, the response was not negotiation, but a siege designed to starve it into submission. The deaths of thousands of civilians were not a tragedy, but a necessary business expense to re-establish a profitable trade route. The same logic applied to the environment. A forest was not a living ecosystem, it was a stockpile of timber for the next caravanserai. An oasis was not a community's only water source, it was a free fuel depot for passing caravans to be drained without a second thought. Even the spread of plague was rationalized. If a ship captain knew his crew was sick, he would still set sail, because the cost of delaying his precious cargo of spices was greater than the risk of spreading death to the next port. This was the ultimate dark truth, a precedent that echoes through the centuries. The Silk Road proved that once a system prioritizes profit above all else, it creates its own brutal morality, one where any atrocity can be justified as the cost of doing business. And in that stark equation, humanity itself becomes the most disposable commodity of all. The final dark truth is that the road's brutal history is now being polished and repackaged to serve modern ambitions. Across the world today, the name Silk Road is being deliberately invoked to lend a romantic, benevolent sheen to massive new infrastructure projects. This is not a simple historical reference, it is a calculated strategy of historical whitewashing. By wrapping a modern initiative in the golden glow of the ancient trade route, contemporary powers can frame aggressive economic expansion as a peaceful revival of cultural exchange. The reality on the ground, however, often tells a very different story. Consider the immense loans offered to smaller, developing nations to build ports, railways, and highways. When those countries inevitably struggle to repay the crushing debt, they can be forced to surrender strategic assets or make sweeping political concessions. This is the modern equivalent of the ancient debt slavery that fueled the original Silk Road, updated for the global banking era. The environmental cost is also a haunting echo of the past. New roads and pipelines are cut through fragile ecosystems, displacing communities and accelerating deforestation, mirroring the desertification caused by ancient caravans. The local artisans and small businesses are once again pushed aside by the influx of foreign goods and labor, repeating the pattern of economic dependency that locked ancient producers in perpetual poverty. This repurposing of history is perhaps the most insidious dark truth of all. It uses our collective nostalgia for a romanticized past to disguise a modern reality of exploitation, creating a smokescreen of cultural heritage that obscures the very same patterns of power and subjugation that made the original Silk Road so dark. The road's legacy is not just one of forgotten suffering, but of a story that is still being twisted to serve the powerful, proving that the control of history is the ultimate form of control. The Silk Road ultimately stands as history's great paradox, a network that connected humanity while carrying the very tools of its destruction. It wove a tapestry of breathtaking cultural exchange on a loom of unimaginable suffering, creating wealth so vast it could build empires, yet founded on a moral bankruptcy that devalued human life itself. These 30 dark truths are not merely footnotes, they are the central narrative, forcing us to exchange our romantic gaze for a clear-eyed look at the human cost. The glittering silk that adorned a Roman aristocrat was a product of fear, spun by workers who faced execution for revealing a secret. The spices that flavored an imperial feast were harvested by farmers locked in permanent poverty. The very paths that carried ideas and innovation also delivered the plague that halved a continent. So the next time you hear the name Silk Road, let it evoke more than just exotic spices and shimmering fabrics. Let it call to mind the enslaved porter whose bones still lie beneath the Taklamakan dunes, the merchant who died of loneliness far from home, and the countless communities erased by the slow, quiet violence of economic necessity. Their silent stories are the true, unvarnished history of this ancient world, a stark reminder that progress, when untethered from compassion, often walks a road paved with forgotten agony. If this journey into history's hidden shadows has changed your perspective, we would be grateful if you shared your thoughts below and subscribed for more explorations that challenge the stories we think we know.